So we've been covering Lama Tsongkhapa's kind of a middle-length text on the stages of the path to enlightenment. Actually, we're in an interesting section which is about how to meditate. Actually, that's really what we're up to. We're on page 211, actually, where it's really about the exact section is how to, it calls the presentation of the faultless approach to meditation. So we already covered, just I'll mention it, Lama Tsongkhapa kind of in this section talked about, first, how do you choose an object of meditation? He said they're all different, many different choices, and it's up to you kind of thing. Right? It could be the breath, or it could be an image. Like he gave the example of a visualized image of the Buddha, but then he gave many other examples like impermanence or all different, even like meditating on the nature of mind. So there are many different objects, but one point he makes is so if a person's going to try to deepen their meditation practice, then for a period of time they would choose one object and stay with it. And because you'll see, he says, we have to become familiar with whatever we're going to meditate on. So we just did the breath, so that makes sense. That's an easy one to be familiar with because it's not mysterious, right? But then, okay, so now he gets into, he makes a point. He's talking about what is meditative. He's getting into like, what does it mean to cultivate meditative stabilization? And so he says, and I'll read this part, it's going to come up again and again as he's describing how to meditate. So he says, the meditative stabilization to be accomplished here has two features. It has the factor of intense clarity of an extremely clear mind, and it has the factor of non-conceptual stability of a mind abiding single-pointedly on its object. So he's pointing out here that when a person's cultivating meditation, right, they're actually cultivating, if they're doing it correctly, gradually two things should develop. And it's a matter of degree, of course, as we progress, but this is like the aim. And I'm going to do it in the opposite order. So one is, and I'll say it's important here, non-conceptual stability of mind, abiding single-pointedly on the object. So what he's getting at there is when we're cultivating meditative stabilization, first of all, we're not conceptualizing. Does that make sense? When he says non-conceptual, it means we're not sort of, so like, that you're not sort of, first of all, you're not thinking about other things, but you, in this case, when you're really trying to develop meditative stabilization, you're not even thinking about the thing you're meditating on. You're kind of non-conceptually abiding on it. So if you're breathing, you're really focusing on the sensations of the breath. You don't continue to think, oh, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, oh, wow, look, I'm breathing deeply, I'm breathing shallow. That's not helpful at that point. Does that make sense? If you're not cultivating meditative stabilization, you might do that. But when you're really trying to develop meditative concentration, but the same thing, if you were visualizing the Buddha, you're supposed to have become familiar with the image beforehand, right? So you don't, at that time, you're not saying, oh, wow, look how pretty the hands are. Oh, the begging bowl's like this color. It's not, so you're not conceptualizing in that sense. And then he says, of a mind abiding single-pointedly on its object, right? So, of course, at the beginning, we're not able to abide single-pointedly on the object. But he's saying that's the goal. That's what we're cultivating, is this kind of single-pointed, where the mind is completely focused on whatever and we're moving towards that. Does that make sense? At the beginning, in the first stage of meditative concentration, that's not at all what one actually experiences. But that's what we're moving towards. And then the second quality, the first quality he lists here, is with an intense clarity of an extremely clear mind. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Right? Because that's one, so you see this right? And we're going to see this as we get into his description of the problems in meditation, or the mistakes people make in meditation. And actually, I'll say it now, in brief, and then we'll get into more detail then. This idea of an intense clarity, right? What he's getting at there is sometimes, actually this is really true, especially if historically we've sort of been stressed out, right? And we've sort of been, and also having a lot of what I call discursive thoughts, which in our culture are very common. It's like we live in a very busy part of the world, in a busy place. So like if there are a lot of discursive thoughts and stress, then at the beginning in meditation, or up to a certain point in meditation, actually, and Lama Tsongkhapa says here, even experienced meditators made this mistake in Tibet. So if you start developing meditative concentration, at the beginning your mind's jumping all over, right? Then as you continue, your mind starts to calm down and stay with the object. You stay with whatever, let's say it's the breath, right? So your mind starts to stay longer with the breath. And what he's saying here, in a way, there's a temptation at that point, because it feels peaceful, right? And so there's a temptation to sort of let the mind sink a bit, or be a little dull, because it feels peaceful and calm. And what he's saying is that's a trap in terms of meditation. That if you let your mind become kind of dull and sink down, there's a kind of feeling of peace, but what you're actually cultivating is a kind of dull mind, actually, and that's not the goal of meditation. The goal is peace, but with clarity. Does that make sense? As he says here, intense clarity of an extremely clear mind. So the idea is once we can hold the object, we want to have a kind of vividness to our experience of meditation. And that takes practice, and we'll get into the details of how you do that. But he's making a point there. Does that make sense? That if you're cultivating a kind of genuine meditative experience and a true meditative stability, then you want both of those features. So you want the mind that stays with the object, but you also want this kind of, as he says, intense clarity or sort of vividness to your experience, not a kind of dull or sort of sinking mind. You don't want the mind to feel like it's sinking down. You want the mind to be stable, but also kind of clear. So we'll get into more of that later. But those are the two features of successful or sort of, what's the word? Those are the two of the features you're cultivating, let's put it that way, when you're developing meditation. Now he makes a couple points that were referring to other texts by other people. So he says, those are the two essential features of meditative concentration if you're developing. Then he says some people say there are three features, and they say bliss is another one. And although bliss does come at certain points in your meditative, if you continue to meditate, there is a kind of bliss that arises. He says, he makes a couple points. He says, that, at one point he says, he makes a point like there are certain, I guess what he's getting at here is this, is that there are certain levels of meditative concentration where bliss comes, but there are other levels where that's not a feature. So if you include bliss as essential to it, you're kind of missing the point, because it's not always part of meditative experience. Bliss comes at certain levels of meditative concentration, but it's not, two things. One is it's not always present. It's not something that you actually actively cultivate. It's a side effect of certain levels of meditative concentration.
So Dr. Lama, what would be the definition of bliss? Like a vibration on your back or a vibration on your head and that sort of stuff. Is that considered bliss?
They're actually, in the texts on that, where when they'll teach on it later actually, but they differentiate two different types of bliss. So one is physical, so that could be like that. Like so where you have, in the body actually experiences blissful sensations. And that could be part of meditative. If you continue to cultivate meditation, there will come these points where you'll experience physical. But again, if you become attached to those, that disturbs your meditation actually. And then there's also a kind of mental bliss that can arise that's different. That's not in the body as much as the mind itself kind of experiences a kind of bliss.
But could that be post-meditative experience as opposed to in meditation we're talking?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, there comes a point. I mean, there comes a point where both arise in meditation when you achieve actual calm abiding. But actually, along the way, Kenshin actually pointed this out. Like, there's a point where you achieve something called calm abiding, where there's an intense experience of both physical and mental bliss, and then they kind of subside at a certain point. But Kenshin was pointing out, as you are progressing towards that, yeah, you can have all kinds of experience of physical pleasure, mental sort of pleasure, bliss, and so on. And those are kind of just side effects. And actually, the physical ones, really, the idea is this, is that from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, as you cultivate meditative concentration, your mind becomes very peaceful and concentrated. What happens actually is that according to Tantric Tibetan Buddhist tradition, inside the body are, it's kind of similar to Chinese medicine and also Indian Ayurvedic medicine. There are subtle energies in the body. And so as your mind develops a kind of deeper concentration and peacefulness, those energies settle down. And that changes your physiology in a sense. And it gives rise to kind of feelings of bliss as those energies kind of shift in a positive way, become peaceful. So that's just a natural side effect of developing concentration. So that can happen like during meditation. So because of that connection of the mind and the body, basically. Whether you're in meditation or sometimes after meditation, these kinds of experiences can arise. And I think it's an important point where he says he doesn't add bliss, though, as one of the two features, right, that's essential. Because if you were searching for bliss or cultivating bliss also in your practice, that would be a problem, wouldn't it? It would be a distraction. It's supposed to be a natural side effect. And if you sort of are looking for the bliss and trying to, that becomes actually a distract. Actually, then you're conceptual, right? He said earlier, a non-conceptual stability on the object of meditation. So if you're supposed to be focusing on your breath, but you're searching for bliss, you're not focusing on your breath, so it actually becomes an obstacle to meditation. So it'd be a mistake to do that. And then he makes another point. He says, in some other, he says, so some people say bliss, and that's why shouldn't be included in the two essential features. And then he says, others say kind of limpidity, like a limpid quality. And he said, which means, and he actually explains it here. He says there is a kind of experience of clarity, like what's the word? Limpidity is the word he uses here, the translator uses, but we'll get into what it means. He says, so this kind of quality of limpidity has two aspects. And what he says is he points out there are two aspects of that. One is where the mind itself, the consciousness, becomes like an immaculate crystal bowl full of water being hit by sunlight in the absence of clouds. So he's saying there's this kind of, you can imagine that, right? If you see like a beautiful, clean crystal bowl being hit by sunlight and there's kind of rainbow-like quality to it, that's the mind itself being very clear or limpid. And then he says the other is sometimes you can have a kind of, if you develop deep concentration, you can have that experience regarding whatever you look at. And that's like also outside of meditation. And I've read stories like this where like, I remember one story, like there was a person who was in meditation in the Himalayas, and then they stopped their session, and he said, oh, my experience was when I looked at the mountain, it felt like I could count every atom in that mountain. Like the object appeared so clearly to my consciousness that it was as though I could count the atoms in an entire mountain. And then what he says, though, is that he says, don't count those as something separate, because if you do the clarity, right, we said earlier, that one of the two characteristics of meditation is the intense clarity of an extremely clear mind. And so he says, if you continue to cultivate that clarity, then you will have experience. What he's getting at is this, is when you're meditating, you're cultivating this kind of stability, right, where you're focused on the object. But if you also include cultivating clarity, then eventually these kinds of other experiences of the mind being very clear and objects appearing very clearly, again, will be a side effect of that. But you don't need to look for that separately, just cultivate clarity on whatever you're meditating on, and all of that will happen naturally as a side effect. Does that make sense? So he's saying these two other qualities of sort of looking to see, like, so instead of, like, so you don't sort of go, oh wow, I want mountains to appear so clearly to me, or I want my mind to appear like this crystal bowl or something. If you're doing that, you're distracted again. And it's not the point of meditation. So he's saying, don't count that as a separate thing to focus on. Just focus on the two, the non-conceptual stability, and a kind of clarity, or vivid. I call it clarity or vividness, maybe a vividness to your experience, not a dullness.
So vividness of like physical features, or I mean, it sounds like we're like focusing on physical features instead of like a. I mean, if you're concentrating on the Buddha, are you just like trying to picture a picture, or are you trying to
so if you were
focus
going
on all that is the Buddha?
If you were going to cultivate, like, so if you were going to meditate on the image of the Buddha, right? But what he says is this, is before you start developing meditative concentration, you would become familiar, like you would take a statue or a painting or something, right? You would look at it with your eyes, you would think about it, you would notice the details of it. This is all before you're doing this, though, right? Because with meditation, we'll get to this, it has to be something that's already familiar. So you're not becoming newly familiar with the object while developing concentration. So, like, let's say you said, okay, I want my object of meditation to be, like the image of a Buddha. So before you meditate, you'd look at the statue, you'd think about it, you'd notice the different. You'd be like, okay, what's the? That time you would say, what is his eyes like? What are his eyes like? What's his hands like? And you would sort of memorize that image. But then he says, then when you would sit down to meditate, you would, first of all, you wouldn't use your eyes at that time. It would be your mental image at that time. right? That's one point. Second point is, you wouldn't think of it like a statue, you would think like the Buddha's really there. So you would imagine it like a being made of light.
So we
that's
just
present.
saw three-dimensional, three.
Exactly. Yeah, not a painting, but you imagine like a being made of light actually there.
Okay.
And then what he says is at that time though, since you're not trying to conceptualize, right, you're just trying to abide on the object with clarity, he says, once you're going to meditate, so you're not newly sort of thinking about it, right? So you sit down to meditate, and then you just bring to mind that image. And what he says is, some days it may just be a vague sort of outline. Just stay with that and abide on it. Other days you may see the hand. Fine, stay with that and abide on it. Other day you might see an eye. Whatever part appears to you, stay with that and stay with it as clearly and as stably as you can. And what he says is if you do that, gradually the image will naturally become complete and clear for you. Whereas if you keep conceptualizing, it won't actually. So in other words, at the time when you're meditating, you're not thinking, oh, the Buddha's so beautiful, or oh, wow, look at both. Like, if you just get an ear, like you're not thinking, well, what's the other ear? Where's the, like you just stay with what, now if something unrelated to that image arises, then you're distracted and you have to come back. But what he's saying is, for a beginner, like us, that whether it's the outline or one part of the Buddha or the whole image of the Buddha, it doesn't matter. Just stay with that in a stable, cultivating stability and clarity, and stay with that object, and that's all. And what he says, is that if you do that over time, then gradually it will become clearer and clearer and more and more. Your concentration will improve naturally. And so he says, like, don't worry if you're not, like, some people when they start, they're like, oh, but I'm not seeing the whole thing so clear and so on. And he says, don't worry about that. Just stay with what arises as long as it's that. But again, like if you suddenly think of, he makes this point. He says, if the Buddhist, like if your object of meditation is the Buddha sitting like that, right? He says, and then you suddenly see the Buddha dancing around, you've lost your object. You need to come back. If you see Tara or Avalokiteshvara at that time, then you're distracted and come back. So in other words, whatever the object is that you're meditating on, you have to stay with that object. But whether it's part of the object, all of the object, it doesn't really matter. The key is, because the key is cultivating stability, right, and then clarity. And he makes one more point I'll mention, because I said those are the two characteristics of good meditation, stability and clarity. But he makes another point, stability usually comes first. Does that make sense? Like, whereas if you don't have stability, you're not going to have clarity because you're losing the object. So he says, first cultivate, first focus a little more on stability, and then once you have a little bit of stability, start bringing in clarity. Okay, so then he's explaining what I've already explained, and then he says, then he makes a point, which is really important in terms of the rest of how you meditate, how you cultivate this meditative concentration.
Which page are you on?
So just change it to 12, the top of 212. So what he says next is this, each of those two characteristics that you're trying to cultivate has a psychological obstacle to it that we can overcome through practicing meditation, and that's that's an essential feature of how you develop in meditation, is to recognize and sort of work with the obstacles. And of course we have obstacles, right? Like in other words, if you didn't have obstacles, you'd already be able to sort of meditate on whatever you want for as long as you want in some kind of blissful way. That's not the case. So what he says here is this: the thing that impedes or sort of blocks clarity is what he's going to use these two words. He's calling it laxity, and we'll get into what that is. So it's okay. And then he says, and the thing that blocks non-conceptuality and that single-pointed non-conceptuality is excitement. And he says, I'll actually read this. So he says, so if you do not, oh wait, where is it? Okay. So laxity and excitement become the main obstacles to the accomplishment of pure meditative stabilization. So he's going to use those terms to describe what we have to kind of work with in our own mind in order to develop meditative stabilization.
And laxity
so-
means clarity?
No, so laxity is the opposite of clarity. Laxity is the obstacle to clarity.
Oh, Oh, I see.
And excitement's the obstacle to single-pointed non-conceptuality, is how he puts it. And so I'll describe excitement first, and then laxity. I'll keep doing them in the opposite order, but I think it's easier. So excitement, right, is where the mind is kind of stirred up or too excited, and it's tending to jump away. Does that make sense? Like what? And oftentimes it's excited by. It can be excited by anything, but particularly desire, right? So in other words, so you're trying to focus on, say, your breath, right? But then you're thinking, oh, what am I going to have for lunch? Right? That's excitation, right? You're trying to focus on your breath, but you're thinking, oh wow, tomorrow at work I have to do this, or I want to do that, or I want to call my friend, or I want to whatever, like. So that's where the mind is overly excited and is sort of jumping away, right? And so you can see how, of course, that's going to be an obstacle to single-pointedness, right? Because you're not single-pointed, your mind's jumping to all kinds of other things. And at the beginning, of course, what we call sometimes our monkey mind, right? That's the phrase, isn't it? Like the mind's jumping, like if you ever watched a monkey, right? They jump all over the place. Like, and so I think actually at the beginning we're more, that's why I'm starting with excitement, is we're more familiar with excitement when we start off with meditating. Right, so our mind is always like wanting to jump to something else, and meditative concentration, cultivating it, means that we have to be able to work with that, right, and sort of apply antidotes to that excitation so that we can bring the mind back and the mind will calm. Laxity, in a way, is where the mind lacks clarity, right? So the mind is sort of, overly lax. Like I give an analogy, like if you have a bed that's too soft, right? That's like lax. Like it's like sinking down into the bed, or is it like it's not good for your back or something. It's like, so the mind is sort of like that. It's sort of too lax, too soft, or like a guitar. I sometimes think of it like a guitar string. Right? If a guitar string is properly tuned, then you can play it, right? But if it's too loose, it's like whoa, like you do that and it just makes like some kind of sound that's too doesn't make a proper sound. The mind is kind of like that. It's not intense enough. It's not vivid enough. It's sort of, there's a dullness.
So laxity, probably the predecessor would be not just that moment, but a lot of other things leading to it, like faith, maybe, effort, or aspiration, or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
rather than
Those would be
just-
antidotes to laxity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Than just that at the moment of meditation with the laxity.
Yeah, and I guess the key though is at this phase, what he's getting at is we have to learn to identify these in order to apply the antidotes. So you have to know what they are and sort of be able to identify them in your own experience, and then you can apply antidotes that you're discovering. And that's what he actually says that next. He says, that is why if you do not know how to identify, right, so this is what he's getting at, in your own experience, he's saying. And he makes a point here, subtle and gross laxity, and subtle and gross excitement. And if you do not know an impeccable method for sustaining meditative stabilization that stops both of them, then you're not going to develop calm abiding in meditation. And so he makes a point here. He says there's subtle and there's gross. So actually, like with excitement, gross excitement, actually I'll make this point too, because you'll if you meditate enough, you'll have all these, you'll experience all the obstacles. That's great, right? But gross excitement is where the mind's actually jumping away. Does that make sense? Like you're losing the object. So like, or it's like you're trying to meditate on let's say, breath, for example. That's what I'm using. And then your mind jumps away to think about some other topic, right? You've lost the breath. That's a very gross kind of excitement. Then there's a kind of subtle excitement that can develop where your mind is keeping with the object, but there are still these other thoughts going on about other things. So you're not totally losing, in this case, the breath, right? But you're still thinking, oh, there's a sensation, but another part of your mind is sort of jumping to think about your friend or whatever, like movie or lunch or whatever topic. Does that make sense? So it's a subtler kind that's still an obstacle to single-pointed, right? Because he already said the goal in meditation is to develop this kind of single-pointed mind. So if your mind is sort of staying with the object but partly going away, or part of your mind is, that's still a kind of obstacle, right? So it's a subtler form of excitement. And then the same with laxity, right? If laxity gets very extreme, you kind of just space out and don't think of anything, actually, right? You lose the object because you're so sort of spacey. But then there's a kind of subtle laxity, and he gets into that. This is a very important one for meditators to become familiar with. And that's what I was starting to say earlier. With subtle laxity, you don't lose the object, but there's no vividness, there's no clarity. Does that make sense? And so your mind stays with the object, but in a kind of dull, weak sort of way, and that's not a good kind of meditation either. So we have to kind of learn how to identify both of those in our own experience. Does that make sense? And that's what he's saying. And so he says, he's clarifying, he's saying, so these two, laxity and excitement, are adverse conditions to the accomplishment of calm abiding, and that we have to learn to identify them in our own experience, and the methods of stopping them, he says, which I'm going to teach below. So he's saying, now first I want you to be able to understand why you need to stop these in order to develop those two qualities of meditation, and how to identify them, and then we'll teach how to overcome them. So he's really getting into how do you develop deep meditative concentration. Right? And then he points out, now he starts to say, and this is, okay, so now he's getting into now you understand kind of what is meditative concentration, right, or meditative stabilization, and what are the two main obstacles to it. Does that make sense? That's what he's covered so far. And now he says, in order to progress in your meditative stabilization, you have to cultivate two mental factors, two kind of qualities of mind in practice of your meditation. And these are the keys to developing, to progressing. And so he says there are two requirements, or two qualities to be cultivated. And so the names, he gives two, I'll say the names of these two. The first is mindfulness, and the second is introspection. One thing that's interesting, right, so we often, in the West now, in America, for example, mindfulness is on the cover of Time magazine and all that, it's very, very common. But here he gives a formal definition of what is mindfulness. Does that make sense? He's going to get into that. And how do you use it to develop meditative concentration? And then the second quality of introspection. In the formal Buddhist context of meditation practice. And so what he says is, first he makes a point. He says, the function of mindfulness is that it prevents your mind from scattering away from whatever you're meditating on. And then he says, introspection, the second quality, is the quality of mind how does he say it? That's aware when your mind has scattered away. So in other words, when the mindfulness, because mindfulness, until we're perfect at meditation, mindfulness won't be perfect. Does that make sense? So we're going to lose the object sometimes. So then we need this quality of introspection so we know if we've lost what we're meditating, lost the object of meditation. Well, I'll continue on the way he's presenting it because he goes into more about these things. So he makes a number of points. So he's talking about when you begin to meditate. He says, I'll read this part. He says, you visualize the basis of observation, right? So whatever you're going to meditate on, if it's an image of the Buddha, or if it's some other image, or if it were your breath or your mind or something like that, then it would be visualized, but you would kind of bring to mind, or you would bring your attention to, let's put it that way, whatever you're going to meditate on. He says, then once it appears, you should generate a forceful mode of apprehending the object with your consciousness. Uplift the mind and place it without newly analyzing anything. So that's kind of what I was saying a few minutes ago. At the time when you're actually meditating, right, you're not analyzing. Does that make sense? If you're cultivating, there's analytical meditation, but here he's talking about stabilizing meditation or meditative concentration. So he's saying that when you're doing this kind of meditation, you're not analyzing anything newly. So you're not sort of thinking, you're not conceptualizing. Does that make sense? And then he's also saying, but you bring it to mind, and it should be something you're already familiar with, as I said, not something you're newly sort of figuring out. And he says, and there should be a kind of forcefulness, or a clarity, or a kind of intensity, a little bit, not extreme intensity, not like, because then your mind will be too excited, right? But I remember once a monk I know who spent a long time in retreat, he said, especially at the beginning, there should be a little bit of almost like intensity or tension in the mind, because you're trying to keep that a certain clarity and a certain focus. There comes a point at a very advanced level where it says relax the mind. But that's because you've overcome laxity at that point, and your mind is already intense naturally. But until that happens naturally, we shouldn't be too lax. Does that make sense? We shouldn't be too sort of chilled out, because then our mind will sink down. So you're not conceptualizing, but you're trying to hold whatever that is that you're meditating on with a little bit of intensity. He says a little bit of forcefulness. Now he says, and this is interesting, he says, what is mindfulness? And he says, non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to the thing it's familiar with, so the function is non-distraction. Right? So mindfulness in this sense means non-distraction. Does that make sense? It means that once you choose an object to be, so we actually, in the sense that he's using it, right, mindfulness means you have an object that you're familiar with, and you're, you're not forgetting it, or you're not becoming distracted from it. So you're kind of keeping your focus on it. Some translators I knew said, like, I don't think that's a good translation, I don't know, but mindfulness I think is the best translation for this term, but the idea is that by being mindful of it, you're staying aware of it. Does that make sense? Whatever that object is, and the mind is not getting distracted, it's not drifting away from that. And here, I'll just differentiate this a little more fully, right? So I'm going to read that one more time. What is mindfulness? Non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to the thing it's familiar with, so its function is utter non-distraction. So in the commentaries to this text, they mention that there are three factors in that sentence. So I'll just mention them. So to kind of tease them out. I mean, they're all there, but to tease them out a bit. One is the mind's already familiar with the object. Does that make sense? So it's not one is that mindfulness means you're being aware of something you're familiar with. The second is you don't allow the object to be forgotten, right? So you don't forget about it. And the third is non-distraction, right? So in other words, that even when you're not forgetting about it, your mind is not partially distracted to other things. So that's actually the formal kind of description of what mindfulness is. Yeah, and so he's just clarifying. He's saying, so whatever you're going to practice, if you're going to practice meditative concentration and practice mindfulness with respect to something, first become familiar with it. You know, if you were going to, I gave that example, the Buddha image. If you were going to be mindful of that, you have to first be familiar with what the image is, and then practice this kind of mindfulness. And now there's a whole section here which I'll kind of describe because I think it's quite it may be useful. He makes this point. He says non-forgetfulness or non-distraction in this sense, right, of mindfulness, doesn't mean. He's making a point. He says that's not like the non-forgetfulness of like somebody like when you're in school, right? And they say memorize your times tables or something, right? And then you can like memorize them, and then when they say what's the times, what's 6 times 7, you can repeat it back, right? That's not what he's talking about. He's making a point. He's saying, in this sense, mindfulness isn't like memorization. Right? He's saying what mindfulness is you're tying your mind to the object. Like you're keeping in other words, it's like you're connecting and he gives an analogy, which is a traditional analogy from ancient Buddhist texts. And this traditional analogy is this. He says, sometimes we talk, right, and sometimes people talk, I just did it, right? It said monkey mind, but here there's a different metaphor. He says, in this metaphor, or let's call it a simile, your mind is like, right, so your mind is like a wild elephant. Okay? And that's an analogy that was often used in ancient Buddhist texts. The reason being, if you think of like ancient India, right, at the time the Buddha was teaching, like an elephant that was angry and crazed was quite dangerous. Actually, Ken Rinpoche told me, like, sometimes when he first, he's a teacher who teaches at the center, an older Tibetan Lama, and he said when he first, in Tibet, they never had elephants, right? And then they resettled the Tibetan refugees to South India. And so they arrived in South India, they didn't have any food, right? So they immediately had to plant some crops. And then, he said, then like, there were wild elephants, so the wild elephants figured out quickly, right? Oh, the crops. So the wild elephants would come there to eat their crops. And so then, I think it was funny, so somebody said, like, then they said to the Khen's Rinpoche, oh, you know, go out, like, he was young still at the time, so somebody said, oh, go out and just, you know, protect the crops from the elephants. But then he was laughing, he's like, well, what, you know, if you're a person out in a field, how are you gonna, like, and then, like, you know, wild elephants coming and they want to eat the crops, and you know, if you're gonna wave your arms, they don't care, right? They're much bigger, so they'll just knock you over, and they'll knock the crop. And that was what he was saying also, even if they want to eat, like, if they see an ear of corn over there and they want to eat it, then they would step on all these other, you know, like plants, right? All the other plants would get trampled, and then they would eat the one ear of corn, and then they would walk out another direction, and they would trample all those corn. So I think, actually at the time of the Buddha, it was the same idea as what Khen's Rinpoche experience was. In other words, if it's a wild elephant, your entire field of crops could be destroyed very quickly if the elephant is in the mood to do that.
Also, it's a rebirth of a bad ethics, as per Sadhguru.
So they give this analogy. They say, so if you think of your mind as like a wild elephant, in other words, and the meaning there is this, is that if you don't tame your mind, or learn to control your mind, then just like the wild elephant can destroy the crops, your mind can make you miserable. Does that make sense? Like if we don't learn to control our mind, then our mind goes all over the place and cultivates all kinds of anger or fear or hatred or you know, craving and so on, and then our lives get out of control. So he's saying, so think like, so it's like, okay, I have to learn how to control my mind, right? So then they give this analogy continues. So if somebody's trying to kind of like tame a wild elephant, they say that here it says the first step is they have a rope, right? And they connect the elephant to like a tree stump or a tree, something like that. So it can only go so far, right? And then when it goes, if it goes, you know, like it's not like right next to the tree, but if it goes a little bit certain distance, then the rope, of course, pulls, and then it goes back towards the tree stump. And so what he's saying is that that rope is a metaphor for mindfulness. Does that make sense? So in mindfulness, we rope, or we kind of tie our attention to whatever the object of meditation is that's in this metaphor, like the tree, right? And so it doesn't allow our mind to drift too far away from it, right? And over time, what does that do? Actually, if you think of the elephant as a good metaphor, isn't it? Because like at first the elephant might try to sort of like, you know, like see if it can pull the tree stump out or tree out or something like that or whatever. But if the tree's too thick, right, then eventually the elephant starts to calm down and get used to being near the tree. Does that make sense? And that's what happens with our mind, actually. If you start to meditate on an object, you'll see, right? Your mind will keep trying to jump away, right? And the rope of mindfulness has to be strong enough to keep it there, or it won't calm down. Does that make sense? So it's like that's what this metaphor is getting at. And then he says, if you're taming like an elephant tamer or something, the first thing is they have this rope, right, which is the metaphor for mindfulness. Then the other thing they have is a kind of, what do you say, a metal hook, or a metal piece of metal with like a kind of, that, where they lead the elephant back. Does that make sense? So it's sort of like a, what would we call it? It's not like a lasso, because that's like more like a rope, but like a metal sort of guide or something. Right? And so if they're trying to sort of teach the elephant to go a certain way, right, then they would, first the rope would keep it from going too far, but then the finer adjustments, the elephant tamer would sort of use that, right, to teach the elephant to move this way or move that way. And what he's saying is that hook, or that guide, is introspection. Does that make sense? So first, the rope is what we tie our mind to the object of meditation. Then this hook is a metaphor for if we catch our mind starting to drift away, we direct it back. That's all. This is a metaphor for that.
Dr. Lauren?
Yeah.
It says, at least on my print here, gradually ruled with the hook of intelligence. Is that a typo, or introspection is it?
Yeah, no, in the commentary it said that. In this, I mean, that's from actually a particular text, Essence the Middle Way. But it says, in that context, intelligence is referring to the intelligence of introspection, where we're intelligent enough to analyze and see what our own mind is doing. It's not general intelligence in the sense of like IQ or some other kind. Here it's referring to specific intelligence in terms of
awareness.
The intelligence of sort of of aware and also, but more than aware, it's also like of analyzing our own mind and knowing our own mind and knowing what our own mind is doing in that sense. So that kind of introspection, that sort of, that's analyzing our mind and that understands what our mind is doing and can redirect it. And so that's it, yeah. And then in stages of meditation, it says, with the rope of mindfulness and with introspection, the elephant of the mind should be tied to that very tree trunk of the object. Right? And so this is the idea, though, right? Is that do you just get the feeling for yourself? I mean, this is a metaphor, right? But do you get the feeling for yourself in meditation? The idea is that once you choose this object of meditation, whatever it is, and you just keep coming back to it and coming back to it, and you do session after session, that gradually, right, your mind starts to settle on the object. It starts to stay with the object a little more, and then a little more, and a little more. And that's taming the mind, actually. So that's the practice. And he says the principal method of fostering the accomplishment of meditative stabilization is sustaining mindfulness, right? So it's mainly hooking the mind to the object, or tying the mind to the object. And then he says that once you're tying the mind, once you're connecting the mind, once your mindfulness is staying with the object, that it should, that one also needs to cultivate, and this is what we said earlier, a firm apprehension of the ascertaining consciousness. So he says, what he's getting at there is once you're able to keep your mind on the object, also include the sense of clarity, right, or stark intensity, he says, of the ascertaining consciousness. So he's saying, don't let your mind become dull, but kind of try to stay with the object in a kind of vivid way. Does that make sense? Then he just makes a couple other points. He says non-distraction is the same is a synonym, means the same thing as mindfulness. Right? So sometimes in Buddhism you'll hear that term, non-distraction, in meditative context. And he's saying non-distraction and mindfulness have the same, they mean the same thing. It's a mind that does not deviate, from sustaining mindfulness towards whatever object you've chosen. And he makes another point here. He says, sometimes people will cultivate instead of choosing the, say, visualized Buddha image or choosing the breath, he says sometimes, he's making a point, sometimes people will meditate on awareness itself. So like their object of meditation is, they'll use their mind to be mindful of mind, or awareness. And he says, well, if you're doing that, it's the same thing. You still have to cultivate mindfulness of that. You don't think that that's some other, completely other thing. That's just another object of meditation. There's a kind of, they say, in Buddhism, they say the mind has qualities of clarity and awareness itself, right? And so he's saying, if you choose as your object of meditation, this is in Tibetan tradition and Indian tradition, they have this idea of Mahamudra, which is meditation on mind itself. Sometimes they refer to it that way. And he's just saying, if you're doing Mahamudra meditation where you're focusing on the mind itself, then that's just your object of meditation, but you still need to be mindful of that. In the same way you would be mindful of the image of a Buddha or your breath or any other object of meditation. So don't think that somehow, it's a different object, but the process is the same. So he makes that point. Then he makes another, for those of you, like Lama Tsongkhapa often will do this, where he raises like misconceptions about that people often have about meditation in this case, in order to clarify them. So he'll say, people sometimes think this, that's incorrect, here's why. So he does that a lot. So here he's saying, there is the following kind of misconception. So some people will have this misconception where they think, well, I'll just read it. He says, so they think this: when the mind is roused, as explained above, and held tight and placed on the object with non-conceptuality, there is no laxity, but excitement predominates. I can see that I will not thereby gain the capacity for continuous stability. However, my lofty awareness is lowered by loosening my tight grip on it. I see the stability factor arise quickly. This is an excellent method. So that they think the best method is just to relax. So this is actually, that's common actually. You'll see, like, people will say this, like, the best method of meditation is just to relax. And actually, this is a really important point he's getting. He's saying, if you relax, what he's really getting at here is, if you relax too much, too quickly in your meditation practice, you'll just space out. Does that make sense? You'll just cultivate a kind of mind that's spacey, and that's dull, and that has a kind of laxity. Remember I was saying like the soft bed, or like a guitar string that's not tuned enough. So he's saying, if you make that mistake early on, and what he's getting at here is really important, and it's what I was kind of saying earlier, but now he's getting into detail. What he's saying here really is this, is like, for those people who think that, you can see why they think it actually, right? In other words, because it takes effort, first of all, to cultivate that kind of vividness at the beginning. And for them, they feel, well, if I just relax, that vividness might even lead to a little distraction at times. And if I just relax, there's a kind of, it feels peaceful, and sometimes my mind kind of stays, there is a kind of quality of peacefulness and of kind of abiding on the object that feels nice, and they sort of think, well, that must be it. That's meditation. That's correct meditation. And he's saying, you can see how people would think that, but it's incorrect. And now he's saying, this position, right? So he's explaining why it's incorrect. He says, this position fails to distinguish between the occurrence of laxity and the occurrence of meditation. Does that make sense? So he's making a number of points of why that's wrong. One is, people who think that don't understand the difference between cultivating a kind of lax mind and cultivating meditation. Meditation has single-pointedness, but also this kind of, what do you say, intense clarity, right? Clarity of mind. And he's saying here, somebody who has this view doesn't understand that the clarity is part of meditation. So they're not cultivating clarity, and their mind becomes too dull. That's one point he makes. Then he makes another point. He says, he says that. He says, remember, meditation requires two things: stability, but also clarity. Don't leave out the clarity. And then he makes another point. He says, if you think that in such a case, when the mind has become confused and there is darkness, this is laxity, whereas otherwise it's faultless meditation, meditative stabilization, because there's the clarity factor of mental limpidity, apparently you fail to distinguish between lethargy and laxity. So there what he's saying is this, that he's speaking, it's a subtle distinction. One point you got, right? You need clarity. Does that make sense? If you don't have clarity, you're not cultivating the right kind of meditation. But here he's making another point. He's saying also, don't mistake and this is it may sound a little technical when he's saying it, but it's actually experiential, if you really. It's this. When you begin to actually practice meditation, right? If you're practicing meditation, sometimes there will come a kind of experience of, what's the word he uses here? Confusion and darkness, right? That's like sleepiness. Does that make sense? Sometimes that he's calling lethargy, right? Kind of physical heaviness. Like if you can either be actually, sometimes you'll actually fall asleep, right? Sometimes you'll sort of feel very lethargic and heavy, and sort of like your mind is sort of extremely sort of dull and confused and so on. And he's saying that's lethargy, right?
I feel like it's dark.
Yeah.
Very dark, and it's like sometimes you have a feeling of falling down.
Yeah, and what he's saying, that's important. What he's saying here is, we need to differentiate, that's a kind of, what he's calling lethargy, it's like fatigue or something. And that's more extreme than laxity. Laxity is where the mind is usually staying kind of with the object, but is dull, right? But it's not, and so, because what he's getting at is, some people think, well, if I'm not sleepy, and I'm not dark, and I'm in darkness, and I'm not sort of confused, then I don't have laxity. And he's saying, no, you don't have lethargy. Does that make sense? You're not fatigued. But laxity is more subtle than that, maybe, is the way to say it. Laxity, because that'd be like, I don't say it right. Like with laxity, it's like this. It's like if you have the guitar string, it does make a sound, it's just out of tune. Does that make sense? The sound that should be like ding is, something like that. But it still makes the sound. Does that make sense? Here the person is making a sound, so they think, oh, I'm meditating, but their string's out of tune. That's my metaphor. And so what he's saying is, don't mistake that, because then you'll do the wrong kind of meditation, and what you need to do is not to break your string, but is to tighten it a bit. Does that make sense? And that's what he's pointing out here. So he says, don't make the mistake of thinking that you're doing perfect meditation because you're not sort of sleepy and you're able to hold the object, but there's no clarity. You need to fine tune. your practice and sort of tighten the string. And now he gets into a very interesting piece about this. So actually, like it's very subtle in a way too, but all this is quite experiential if you're practicing. Does that make sense? So that's why it's important. He says here, therefore, whenever your awareness is held overly tight, now remember, overly tight, he's saying, right? So use this thing of the guitar string, right? Is intensified, the clarity factor will be present, but excitement will predominate, right? So it's difficult. So what he's saying here is, if you're too tight, right? If you get your meditation too intense or too tight, then your mind will have the clarity. Does that make sense? At that time, but it'll tend towards excitement, and you'll lose the object because your mind will be there'll be too much intensity there, and your mind will kind of get excited, and then it'll jump away. Then he's saying, on the other hand, whenever you relax a lot while sustaining your meditation, the stability will be there, but laxity will predominate, and the intense clarity will be absent. Right? So he's saying, if it's too tight, right, you'll tend towards excitation, and eventually you'll lose the object. On the other hand, if you tend to relax too much, your mind will get lax. You won't entirely lose the object, but you won't have any clarity, and that will be the problem. And so he's getting at this idea of how do you tune it just right. And then he says, it's difficult to retain just the right level of tightness and relaxation. And therefore, it's difficult for meditative stabilization free from laxity and excitement to arise. And then he quotes a famous Buddhist master from India, Chandra Goman, who said, when I make effort, excitement arises. Sinking occurs when I abandon it, my effort. If by this it's hard to get even engagement, what shall I do with my agitated mind? And then he says, when I practice with effort, excitement arises. When I relax it, sinking occurs. If it's hard to find the middle between them, what shall I do with my agitated mind? Right? So actually it's quite, this is a famous Buddhist master, right? But what he's saying is, he's actually sharing his own experience of meditation. He's saying, finding the right tuning isn't so easy. Does that make sense? And it's quite useful to see that, right? Even like Lama Tsongkhapa and Chandra Goman, two of the greatest Buddhist masters in history, are both saying it's not so easy to find that exact tuning. And it can only come about through your own experience, right? And this is the tricky point. That same monk I mentioned, did a lot of meditation in retreats and things like that. And he said that. He was saying something like that to me. He was saying, it's quite, it's difficult to do that, and that, and it's hard to ask somebody else, because it has to be based on your own subtle, you have to actually watch your own mind. People can give you some guidance, but when you're in retreat or something, and you're going, or even if you do a day-long retreat, right, and you go meditate, and you're watching your mind, you'll hear these instructions, but then you have to apply it, right? And then you go, okay, what am I doing now? What's going on now? And to actually identify, am I a little too up or a little too down? Am I lethargic? Right? And you have to be able to identify that in your own experience. And and at the beginning, it's easier in a way, because your mind will get distracted a lot. But then as you keep going and it gets a little less distracted, it becomes harder to actually, for a while, it's like, you have to get, what's the way to say it right? It's like an art, of how to do that. And how to cultivate the right level of tuning, using that metaphor. And it's an interesting point, right? Nobody can do that for you. Only you can do that for yourself, right? And only you can tell, even. I guess if you fall off your cushion, then somebody else can kind of figure it out. but if you're just sitting there like this, nobody knows. It's your mind, right? Your mind could be distracted, or your mind could be on the object. Only you know that. And so you have to kind of watch your own mind. That's the introspection part. Does that make sense? And gradually, and it's like an art, but the point is if you continue practicing, you get better at it, but not just from continuing to practice. You have to be doing the actual work of this. And what he's getting at, this is why it's so important, what he said earlier, is if somebody just is a little bit lazy about that, and just thinks, oh, well, this kind of, I'm enjoying the kind of dullness, or the kind of the laxity part, and they don't continue to make effort at finding the right tuning, their string is always going to be off. Does that make sense? And if they do that for long enough, then that just becomes their version of meditation, And then it becomes very difficult. Then it's like,
The born as a crocodile.
yeah, they're more surprised. Yeah, I mean, it becomes a big problem. So they need to practice, or we need to practice, right from the beginning, trying to get it right. And if we do our best, at the beginning, I guess I'll make one more point. At the beginning, we're not going to get it perfect, right? But as long as we're making effort, it's like, if you think of it like a thing like this, I mean, eventually it comes to the middle. Does that make sense? There may be a day where you're missing it and you're more distracted, or a day where, but as long as you're catching it and trying to get yourself in that middle zone, and more, then slowly we'll get better at it. But what he's saying is, it's actually an implication of what he's saying. I think is, say this right. As long as we're trying to identify and fine tune it, we're on the right track. It doesn't matter if we're great at it or not. But if we have the wrong idea to begin with, then it's quite hopeless in a way, right? In other words, if you're not knowing I'm trying to cultivate this kind of, both of those factors, the clarity and the stability, and you leave one out, then you'll never get there. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it can be difficult, it can take time, but eventually you'll get better and better at it, because just through the effort. But if you're not, if you don't know, oh, that's the goal, this is quite important, isn't it? Because a lot of us, we learn a meditation technique and we go do it, but if you don't get this level of detail, it's quite easy, isn't it, to go either to say, to cultivate this kind of dullness, laxity, right, where you're just you're meditating maybe on whatever, but sort of there's a laxness to it. You think, oh, well, I'm getting something out of it, it makes me peaceful, and you're not noticing that the mind is not having enough clarity. Or the other, right, where people kind of meditate, but they let their mind, they just they do a meditation where they allow their mind to jump away too much, and not cultivate a true mindfulness. And then you sort of, what's the word? You sort of stay stuck, and your meditation doesn't progress at all, actually, at that point. So these are quite important points.
Dr. Lawrence, just makes me think the stability part or the calm abiding. You don't necessarily need to be a Buddhist or anybody to have calm abiding. So clearly, thought came in here. I want to share with you is that all you need to do is give up your desires, and probably you can have calm abiding. You don't need a motivation, which actually is the precursor for, or the faith is a precursor for the clarity part of it. Because the clarity comes about with the faith and aspiration and motivation and that cognitive part of you. But then stability, calm abiding, anybody can have. Just give up all your desires, be in a balanced state where you are not excited.
Well, actually, a couple things. I mean, one is, I agree with part of what you're saying in the sense that, one thing that's definitely true is you don't have to be Buddhist to develop calm abiding. Really, calm abiding is like or meditative concentration, all these things. He's talking about, first of all, they're common to Buddhism and non-Buddhist traditions, so it's not unique to Buddhism. And I sometimes think, really, if you study these topics, whether in, say, these kind of Buddhist texts or Hindu texts, the same, they both achieve this, actually. And it's really just a technology, actually. Really, it's a psychological technology. In other words, there are certain things that will arise. If you start cultivating meditative concentration, certain experiences will happen. They happen in a kind of somewhat predictable order. I mean, different people are slightly different, but there's a kind of progression. Certain obstacles will arise. If you know how to apply an antidote to that obstacle, you'll move to the next step in it. So it's really like an inner technology in a sense. So it's not Buddhist, really. I mean, anybody can cultivate that. But one thing in terms of the technical term of, if you think of the English term calm abiding, which is like a translation of, in Tibetan it would be shine, or I guess shamatha in Sanskrit. So shamatha has both, though. That's an important point. The shamatha has both the clarity and the non-conceptual abiding on the object. So technically, in other words, shamatha would have both of those qualities. Otherwise, it's not shamatha. So shamatha has both the clarity and the. So technically, that's an important point. But yeah, anybody can cultivate that.
I just have a comment. I think this is really useful for me because I always thought that the laxity part was the goal of meditation, and I really fell into that. So this is really helpful for me. And it also influenced my behaviors because my teacher used to tell me, you have to sit up, when you meditate. Your back has to be straight. You have to sit in a certain position. It's almost slightly uncomfortable, but, you know, so that you don't fall asleep. And I kind of used to bend the rules because of that subscription to the idea of laxity, and I said, oh, I can lie down and do it too. And then I'd end up falling asleep.
Yeah.
But whenever I used to slouch or something, a voice would tell me, like, Bob, to sit up, you know?
Mhm.
So that allows me to cultivate the clarity that's needed.
Posture does affect the clarity, doesn't it? Yeah.
And I used to find it to be my objective as well, frankly, up till today. But, you know, like I wake up and meditate, and more often than not, I would kind of like, but, you know, I think that was just part of the relaxing and getting into it instead of realizing I was just going down the wrong path right there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
So you can
that's
still wake up
Lama
and
Tsongkhapa.
meditate even if you're sleepy, but the goal isn't to give in to the laxity, it's to really focus on some sharpness. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's one thing about Lama Tsongkhapa. I was really wondering. I mean, throughout this text, right, he keeps doing it. He goes to like he really knows like what he sort of That's one thing. The Dalai Lama once said that that's what he loved about Lama Tsongkhapa, is that he said Lama Tsongkhapa always goes straight towards the thing that people would misunderstand. Like that's his quality as a writer or something, as an author of text and as a teacher. I guess it was when he was alive, but that he tends to, you know, kind of. The Dalai Lama said that like other teachers might present a more. He said some Tibetan authors have written more books than him, or you know, larger, longer books. But he said, but nobody goes to the hardest point. He said, like Lama Tsongkhapa always goes towards the difficult point and clarifies it, which is a real contribution. And actually, the Dalai, I'll mention this too because it's related to what we were just talking about. In his commentary to this text, as long as the Dalai Lama said, he said, if we allow ourselves to habituate to laxity in our meditation process, he says then if a person were to do that for a long period of time, then gradually actually they would lose their mental sharpness, even their memory would become less precise. He says, and then he actually said he had met some people who had done that, and eventually these were people like who had spent years in retreat, but they had cultivated laxity in retreat, and the Dalai Lama actually said he noticed they had a kind of lack of feeling, where they had lost touch of some of their compassion, actually, not completely, but somewhat. And he said, like, oh, wow, that was a real loss in the sense of, now that was in retreat, so they've done it extreme way, but the Dalai Lama was saying, so that, you know, and that would be, like, since one of the main goals in Buddhist practice is to cultivate love and compassion, that he felt when he met these people who had spent years in retreat or heard about that, he thought, oh, that's like really a loss, yeah, like a real loss. And he said, so, he was saying, so we have to, you know, so it's really important, the clarity is what keeps our mental sharpness. And I had that misunderstanding. I remember that once, many years ago, when I was in Nepal, at Kopan Monastery, Lama Zopa said he had brought one of his teachers to come teach at the monastery, and I was there doing like a month-long retreat at Kopan, of course, you went to one. And it was Kirti Senchab Rinpoche. And Lama Zopa said, oh, Kirti Senchab Rinpoche came out of 18 years in retreat in the Himalayas. And I didn't know, I was young then, didn't know much, and I kind of thought, so I thought, oh, he'll be like, my expectation was he'd be some kind of like really spacey sort of person who had spent years in the Himalayas and would kind of be cool, but would be sort of, I didn't think he'd have, and he came, you know, and he was like, he must have been at that time well into his 70s. And he started teaching, and he was like the sharpest person. I was like, wow, like he's teaching on a text, he was teaching on a text, like Lama Zopa asked him to explain some topic from a text that he had studied like in his 20s, you know. And he was teaching this text, and he was like, he understood every word, he was explaining every detail, and like with great, he was totally blissful, but he was explaining everything with incredible clarity. And I remember I thought, like, wow, he spent 18 years in the Himalayas, how does he remember, and he's in his 70s, how does he remember what he studied in his 20s with so much like detail and memory and clarity? And it's because he had cultivated correct meditation, right? His mind he had actually cultivated such a clear, blissful, stable mind that his memory was better than an ordinary person's, and he could explain these things in such detail. And you know, so to me that was an example where I was like, I had this misunderstanding that a person wouldn't, like, oh, he went beyond words or something. But when he was meditating, he wasn't conceptualizing. But when he came back to words, his mind was incredibly precise. Does that make sense? He could go beyond words when he was in deep meditative concentration, but when he was going to use words, there was clarity there. And it helped me understand this point, that like, oh wow, somebody who really meditated clearly, they're actually more sharp, not less so. And that was helpful to me personally. So then now Lama Tsongkhapa comments on those verses by Chandra Goman, and he says, he's saying that when you hold your mind tight, thus making effort, there can be excitement. On the other hand, when you notice this and relax your mind, that tries too hard to get involved with the object, and you abandon endeavor, laxity of thinking arises. Therefore, it's difficult to find the middle ground, free from the two extremes of laxity, excitement, and even engagement in which the mind abides evenly balanced. If he was there probably presenting that, so he's saying, so clearly Chandra Goman isn't just saying, oh, just relax. Does that make sense? And there is, I'll say one more point here, I think that Lama Tsongkhapa is kind of hinting at, in a way, is there are actually some texts, and actually, last year I was at a teaching in California, and Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche mentioned this, so it was helpful to me. There are some texts by great meditators that say, whereas like there's a line that says like just relax and rest in the nature of mind, or just relax, and Khyentse Rinpoche said, like somebody, you know, he was referring kind of to this kind of point, and he said, this teaching is correct, but he was saying it's for somebody in an extreme, like if you're an extremely advanced level of meditation, where you've made that effort and your mind never loses the object anymore and never loses its clarity. If you're like, there are certain people who have reached a level of meditation where their mind has gone beyond laxity and always has a kind of clarity. And he says at that point, if the person were to continue pushing, it would actually be an obstacle. So he's saying at that level, the person has to just, that person can now completely just relax, and their mind will keep its clarity. And he says, but it's at this he was saying this text is referring to the person who's at that specific level of meditative concentration. There comes a point where, actually we'll get into it later in this text, but there comes a point where, you have to, where, as I say, right, through having cultivated effort and progressed, there comes a point where the effort itself is the obstacle. But that's at a quite advanced level. And so Khyentse Rinpoche was saying, if somebody reads that text who's a beginner and takes that as if it applies to them, then that's a mistake. So you're saying it's a correct teaching, but for a specific point on the path, and that we have to understand what point on the path it is. Otherwise, we read the book or some poem, or we say, "Oh, wow, great!" Like just just relax, or something like that. Where at our level, at any point up to that level, which is still even pretty advanced meditators aren't at that level yet. There still has to be a kind of, first there has to be gross effort and then a kind of subtle effort, but there's only a very advanced level where you stop making this kind of effort. So I think Lama Tsongkhapa is kind of referring to those kinds of verses, and if you read meditative text, you'll come across those. But so understand that's for that level. But for anybody up before that level, just relaxing is not sufficient. We have to cultivate this kind of mixture, right, of relax some, but also intensity, and sort of what does he call a balance?
Nike emblem would work well. Just do it.
Just do it.
Don't relax.
Don't relax too much.
Unless you're uptight, you might be
and then he just makes another point. He says, basically what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here again, which I've already said in a way, is that, we can only learn to find this balance experientially, right? In other words, you have to understand first that's what we're aiming for, otherwise you won't try. But that once you know that's what you're aiming for, in your own experience, and of course, I'll just make a side point here. Of course, if we're doing that, we're going to make mistakes. We're not going to be perfect. That's how you learn. But part of that is that we continue to monitor ourselves and we learn from our mistakes. Oh wow, I was pushing a little too hard in this session and I got distracted. Okay, let me push a little less. Then I pushed a little too less and then I got that sense of sinking. Let me push a little more. And eventually we find that balance. But but he's saying it's not easy. It takes practice and it takes your own process.
So Lama saying in 3 months you'll get calm abiding is not true.
No, I heard
That's
it for.
propaganda.
I heard for the best disciple, if they can do it in 6 months. I heard so maybe for you it's 6 months.
Check crack energy.
3 months I haven't heard of it.
Now in Michigan it was 3 months.
Oh, it's in Michigan.
I was thinking about moving down there.
There's something special about the air in Michigan.
Right.
3 months, I'm down with that.
Yeah, I'd go there.
Yeah, and so he's just giving an experiential thing where he's saying, you know, that you have, eventually you'll reach this, you'll experience these things where you'll say like, you know, you'll be at a certain level of, what's the word, intensity of awareness and abiding, and you'll sort of have these thoughts, you'll have a recognition, oh, if I heighten just a little more, I'll get excited, so don't do that. You know, and then you'll have the experience, oh, if I relax any more than this, I'll start to get lax, so don't do that. You know, and you'll sort of practice this kind of fine tuning.
Which would be a moving target, I would imagine, because we're changing it, we're different every day.
Yeah, that's true too. But yeah, then the idea though is that as you progress, although it will be, you're right, depending on, and it says that in somewhere in here, like, you know, also part of it depends on what you ate and how well you slept and the environment outside you.
Life, you know? Yeah.
Right. But the idea is that if you continue practicing, it's like you're what's it say right? You know, the range of, I guess it's that, is that the range of, you know, at the beginning, if this were, you know, the right place, the range may be like, you know,
Right.
and eventually the idea is that the range would get like this and then like that, you know, and then eventually the range would be, you know, like, you know, so the
Right.
idea is that the range of sort of how far you get off from it would, not, you can't force that to happen, but as you continue practicing, the idea is that it would become a little, it would slowly sort of,
Come to that.
Come
This makes
closer.
me think about like learning how to ride a bike.
Yeah.
And you know, when you find that balance, you don't ever lose it.
Yeah.
You can not ride a bike for 30 years, get on another bike, you find that balance. It kind of strikes me that it must be kind of similar to that. You know, when you find that place.
in yourself, yeah.
Yeah.
That would be easier to get back to it anyway.
Right.
It could be this time or another lifetime, so let's be busy.
A couple
Other way.
eons of lifetimes.
You should say, yeah, it's just different quotes saying the same thing, so. Then he says, a point which is kind of what we've been talking about, all of us. He says, if you sustain your meditation without knowing the above method for applying mindfulness, however much you meditate, only a lot of faults will come out of it. Great forgetfulness, dulling your intelligence, that discriminates among phenomena and so forth. So that was what I was saying earlier in the commentary by His Holiness Dalai Lama, where he was saying, if you don't do this, you know, if you don't have some understanding, and you cultivate the wrong kind of, you know, meditative experience, it can actually affect you if you do that over time in a negative way. Oh, and then he makes another very practical point here. So he says, you know, so we know now that mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is sort of keeping the mind on the object. That's clear, right? You know, so if it were the image of the Buddha, right, it would be just kind of non-conceptually letting the mind abide and not losing that object. Or for your breath, same thing. But then he raises an interesting question. He says, okay, so while you're doing that, right, this idea of introspection, right? So introspection is checking up, right? Checking on your mind. Have I gotten distracted? Or is there some subtle level of excitation, or a subtle level of laxity, or a gross level of laxity? You know, what's going on? And so he raises a question. He says, okay, so somebody might ask, well, do you do that introspection during the session, or do you do it after the session? Do you look back on the session? And what he says here is, he says, the practical advice he gives is, he says, don't stop your session, continue being mindful of your object of meditation. And he says, but periodically during the session, with another part of your mind, check up. Does that make sense? And notice, how am I doing? And what he says is, first of all, if you don't do that, you could waste the whole session, right, just being distracted. That's one point. But the other is, then you can catch yourself in the moment, you know, and say, oh wow, like you can notice, right? Okay, I'm abiding on the object, but I'm starting to be lax. And so you could lift your mind a little bit, and then just go back to abiding. And that will improve your meditation, and it'll lengthen the time. If you do that over and over again in all your sessions, you'll get better and better at having these longer periods of abiding with clarity. And so he says, so that's his advice. And he says it comes from Kamala Shila's Stages of Meditation text. But so it's this idea that, so you can check up after the session, but you should check up during the sessions. Does that make sense? So while you're being mindful, every now and then you should introspect and just notice, like with a subtle part. It's almost like, the main part of your mind is abiding with mindfulness on your meditation object, but then it's like a little part of your mind checks and looks in. How am I doing? Am I excited? Am I lax? Have I lost the object, or am I at the right tuning? And you just subtly adjust the tuning and then continue abiding, if you can. Then he makes another point somewhere else, where he says, it's at the end, where he says, if what you notice is, I'm exhausted, or I'm so distracted that I can't possibly keep the object, he says, well, then stop your session. He says, at that point, you're cultivating the wrong kind of practice. So he says, stop your session, take a break, and there's advice for this. Like they say, for example, like if you're noticing, I'm just being lax and nothing's helping, stop your session and go look at the sky. Like it's clear and it's beautiful, or something. Like if the sun out, wake yourself up a little bit. Or if you're too excited, stop your session and go think about something sobering. Like so, for example, if you're so excited that you're thinking about desiring for this and desiring for that, and is stop and actually, like there are Lam other techniques in this one.
Life, death or impermanence.
Yeah, think about death and impermanence, think about the nature of suffering, if your mind's like so like, where it's like, all I can think about is excitement about this and that, go think some sobering thoughts about, wait a second, life doesn't last forever, these things aren't gonna bring me ultimate satisfaction, and sort of notice that, and go, yeah, that's true, okay, now I wanna go back and meditate, and then go back to your, so he's saying, if you're checking up on yourself and there's like a kind of an extreme problem, stop the session and do something else and then come back. If it's just a subtle problem, adjust it while you're still mindful, right? And you'll sort of, that's where you're practicing the subtler fine tuning, which is good.
So Dr. Aaron, this introspection part of it, is it before the fact or after the fact? So the question is like, you're meditating and you're basically non-conceptual for a while, and then all of a sudden a thought arises from somewhere. So the introspection would come after the fact, saying, "Uh-oh, a thought has arisen. Let me apply an antidote to it."
Mm-hmm.
That could be one scenario, but the other scenario could be you are in calm abiding or non-conceptual state for a while, and then you forcefully go and introspect on it. Which of the two kind of, both are valid?
Yeah, you want to do both, because like sometimes, like I'll give an example, because like if it's let's say you're being mindful of your object of meditation and then a thought arises. Right? Well, at that time, of course, you would use the introspection to go, oh wow, thoughts arisen, come back, and so on. Like that's excitation, most likely. My mind's getting overexcited. Bring it back to the object. Relax a little bit. Let the mind calm down a little bit and stay with its object. Cultivate stability and go back. And that's it. But sometimes you'll want to check up, even if there's no thought, no conceptual, because, for example, with laxity, you wouldn't. Otherwise, laxity doesn't necessarily have a conceptual thought. It's just sort of this sinking. So you would never notice that unless you're checking up every now and then to look at your own mind and go, oh wow, there's a little bit of laxity. I need to lift my mind up. I need to energize myself, or bring a little more intensity or a little more effort. And what he's saying here is, if you do that, sometimes you can just do that and then again relax, or not relax, and then stop introspecting. Rather, is the way we put it. So if your mind was a little lax, you notice it, you kind of intensify, you bring some more clarity, and then you continue your practice right on from there, and and then you don't introspect again for a little bit, and then check again, how am I doing? So you do both, yeah. And there are times also, not in this text, but if you look in there's a Mahamudra text by the Panchen Lama, where he talks about, there's even a level at which a person can, one is like what you're describing, which is what mostly we do, right? With excitation, you notice the thoughts are risen, and then you come back. He says in that text, there comes a point where a person can also notice the thoughts as the thoughts arising. They're aware, like they can, they're so aware of their own mind that they see the thought as it's beginning to arise, and they can kind of cut it off and go back. And that's even better if they can do that, but that comes at a more advanced level of practice.
Thank you.
Because he makes a few more points that are all related, so it'd be good if we finish this section, because it all fits together. he gives an analogy here, which is funny. He says, he's talking about how, so, we're cultivating this idea of mindfulness where we don't lose the object. And he gives one analogy. He says, sometimes if I think we've all had this experience where you're afraid of forgetting something. Like you have the experience where like maybe you have to get up in the morning for a big exam or something, or there's some important thing that you don't have a piece of paper to write down, and somebody tells you something and you're worried because it's really important to you, like, or you have a password, maybe something, you don't want to forget it. He says, he makes a point, he says, how at those kinds of times where you really care about the object of whatever it is, whatever this piece of information is, then you'll repeat it over and over to yourself, right? You'll go like, oh, start over and over you'll say it to yourself, right? And if you do that long enough, eventually you won't forget it. Like if you continue repeating it enough times, like for a long enough period of time, eventually it'll sort of get ingrained in your mind and you won't forget it. And he says sort of successful mindfulness practice is a bit like that. In other words, you keep bringing your mind, not that you're repeating something conceptually, but you keep coming back to the object, come back to the object, come back to the object, and eventually there's a kind of naturalness that arises, where the mind will then naturally stay with the object. So use that analogy, which I thought was interesting. And then this was the other section I just wanted to mention, is Lama Tsongkhapa then says, it's a section called Indicating the Length of Sessions. And so he says here, okay, so now you understand what the goal is, right? This kind of non-conceptual single-pointedness and this clarity of mind. You understand, how laxity is the obstacle to clarity, and excitation is the obstacle to the non-conceptual abiding, and you understand how mindfulness and introspection help you overcome those. Right? But now he says, on a practical level, how long should your sessions be, and how long should you meditate for in order to have progress? And Lama Tsongkhapa notes some traditional Buddhist texts don't answer that question, but some do. And so he says, I'm going to base it on the ones that do. And first he quotes somebody who makes a point. It says, Kamala Shila, actually, who was a famous Indian Buddhist teacher who came to Tibet at one point. But he says, in his text, he says, like that, gradually you should sit for 24 minutes, 1.5 hours, 3 hours, or as long as you can. And Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point. What Kamala Shila there is getting at is start with shorter sessions and make them longer. Does that make sense? Don't start with longer sessions because then you'll just be tired and distracted. And so that's the first point Lama Tsongkhapa is making, is start with shorter sessions and make them longer. Then he says, for beginners, if the sessions are too long, forgetfulness, the lack of mindfulness will happen. And so Lama Tsongkhapa says that's the problem with doing too long of sessions. Does that make sense? So he's saying, if you start off, with sessions that are too long, you're just going to frustrate yourself and continue to get distracted, and then you'll get used to associating meditation with distraction, and that's not good. And so then there's a point where he says, so go with what's comfortable for you, actually. Does that make sense? And he says you should actually check for yourself and say, what's the length of a session that's comfortable for me, where I can actually keep a reasonable level of concentration and not have too much, and also a reasonable level of alertness, both mindfulness and sort of introspection. And he's saying a point, don't push your sessions beyond that length of time, or it'll just be frustrating and sort of it'll actually habituate you to the wrong practice. Yume Kensei Rinpoche on this point said, better to have the session be shorter and do it really well, and then if you have good sessions, and he even said one time, better to end the session while you're still actually enjoying it and still sort of doing well, because then you want to come back to it, and so on. So the goal at the beginning is not like better to do longer. And then he says,
His Holiness, I recall him telling that if you're not joyful after the session, it's of no use.
That it was too long, probably, yeah, or something. And actually, I'll say that, even when I sometimes, what's there to say, right? Even people who really find meditation difficult because what you're all doing from the beginning, you know. So I think sometimes it's better to do very short, you know, just for the person to have like even a moment of like clarity and sort of concentration can be quite. It's like, wow, oh, that feels. You know, people say, oh, that feels good, because actually, by its very nature, it's pleasant, right? And that's a good thing. It should be pleasant, you know. And then we should stop quicker at that point, because otherwise, I think that's part of why sometimes people stop. You know, people who continue to meditate over time, it's because they enjoy it, actually, right? And they enjoy it because it should be enjoyable. By its very nature, it's enjoyable. So if you're not enjoying the meditation, it means probably you're doing either too much lethargy, or thinking, or lethargy or thinking, or too much excitation, and it's not pleasant. So then shorten the sessions. And he says here also, you know, and where we can still really clearly identify laxity and excitation and apply antidotes. So the session should be short enough that our mind is still able to do that. Does that make sense? And if it's so long that it's hard to catch yourself, then it's probably too long. And so shorten your sessions. Yeah, and he's saying here, if you can't, if you're doing a session that's so long that you can't any longer identify your relaxing excitement, then stop the session. That's too long. Then he says, you know, whereas if you can apply the antidotes, then it's okay to go longer. And then he says, if you are actually forgetting the object, this is what I was saying earlier, if you're forgetting the object completely and you're sort of, you know, and so on, then again, shorten your sessions. If it's extremely distracting, then as we said earlier, take a break, you know, and come back to it. And he says also, Lama Tsongkhapa also says, if you suffer some temporary physical or mental harm, stop. Does that make sense? So he's saying, you know, sometimes people have this idea like, oh, it's good if you're in pain, or it's good if like sometimes people have that idea, like meditate till it hurts or something. And Lama Tsongkhapa here is very clearly saying, no, if your body's hurting, take a break. If your mind is miserable because it's too hard, take a break. He's saying don't continue, actually. He's very clear in his advice about that. And so that's Lama Tsongkhapa's direct suggestion.
He always talks as if His Holiness talks. I mean, same line of thought. Just do it. Very
Well,
practical.
he was the teacher, right? The first Dalai,
Actually,
Lama Tsongkhapa was the first Dalai Lama's teacher. Right?
Exactly. He's a reincarnation, actually, in some way or form, right?
I guess, yeah, so Lama Tsongkhapa's, so Dalai Lama's been the student of Lama Tsongkhapa's for 14 lifetimes, I guess. That's what they say, because he's the 14th Dalai Lama. So.
Yeah.
And one other point he makes here is this, and actually, I'll share a couple of thoughts on this point. One is he's saying, you know, if you're having a very good session where your mind's really able to, like some days you may, also I guess the point is this, one thing is the lengths of the sessions will not be constant over time, as you were saying, because we're different on different days, right? So one point he's implying here is we have to be self-aware. You know, and so if your mind is very like, what's the word, is tired or is very much prone that day towards excitement or something, then you need to do shorter sessions that day, right? And then he says, if you're having a day though where it's like really able to concentrate well and you want to do a longer session, that's fine, right? Because it's experiential, right? The idea is that you're cultivating the best level of balance of those two factors that you could have. So if there's a day where you're like, wow, I'm really getting the balance better today, fine, do longer sessions. But then another day, if something happens, as you were saying, right, something happens in your sort of life and you're really, you know, upset by it, still meditate, but do shorter sessions. You know, you can maybe do a number of short sessions, but don't do a long session. Does that make sense? Better to like, you could even do like a short session of concentration and then maybe, you know, read a text or something, then go back and do another short session of meditation, and then think about something, you know, like think about compassion, or, you know, like, but in terms of concentration meditation, don't do long sessions. That's the idea. I'll just say one other experience I had related to that, which was, I remember one time I was doing some retreat, and then it was actually Ken Rinpoche said this to me, the same thing. He was saying, you know, if you're having a session where you're frustrated, stop. You know, and I remember like at first it was hard for me actually because I thought, well, I want to keep going, and I'll just share that I had that experience where I like, because he had said it, I remember one day I was like doing a session, I was like, I'm not liking this like right now, and I just stopped. I was like, wow, that felt kind of weird, like, because I was doing a retreat. I thought when you're in a retreat you're supposed to meditate, but I was like, no, I'm gonna go for a walk and like look at the sky, and then like the next few days were my best few days of that retreat. You know, like it was like having stopped actually helped so much. That was my point. Like, because my mind relaxed and it was like, okay, I'm not pushing in that way when it's a kind of intensity to the focus, but not try to push through something where you're just not feeling it, and you're not feeling happy, and you're not feeling, your mind, for me, it was both. I think my mind was not feeling happy, my body was feeling heavy. It was much better to stop and go, leave that room and go for a walk, go in the backyard, and whatever, and then, the point is, and then I was like, oh wow, after that it was much easier to concentrate. So really, it's very practical advice is my point, is if you're, if that Lama Tsongkhapa is giving here, right, and he says here, you should not persist in your meditation, but rather eliminate the constitutional obstacles and then meditate, right? So he's saying, if you ate the wrong thing, or your stomach's upset, or your whatever, he's saying, go do something to feel better, and then come back. So that's really important, isn't it?
So, Dr. Lawrence, I haven't had any retreats in my life, so I'm the last person to talk about the experience here. But guide me correctly here. So, quality does matter than quantity on a daily basis. If you're sitting down for a meditation in evenings and mornings and stuff like that, 10 minutes might be better than half an hour and so forth. But when you go to a retreat, you go with the goal of achieving something, like within 10 days, within 5 days. What is the difference? Why would you be, or you're doing vipassana, like a lot of insight meditation and that sort of stuff. I mean, other than that, what is the difference between the two? Because the length of the time is so much, right? Like days and months.
Yeah, my experience of that, which I think is consistent with what other people have told me also, a couple of things actually I'll say. One is, actually, first thing I'll say is this, it's again, this comes from Kent's Rinpoche. He said, if somebody's going in retreat and their idea is oh, I'm going to gain some realization, or I'm going to have some powerful transformative experience, or he was then that's the wrong, he said then they're already on the wrong path. That's a mistake, basically. And he said, so his point, he said, but if you go into retreat and your goal is to practice these techniques in order to have more loving kindness or more compassion and less anger, less craving, I said, then first of all, that's the correct motivation. That's one point. So it's not to have some big, I think it's a mistake if somebody's going to retreat to have some kind of big experience or something. But really, I think the idea with retreat is this, actually, I'll share this, actually just in the last few weeks, it's been fun actually talking to a number of actually it was one particularly, 2 or 3 people who have been doing very long retreats, just because I was traveling around and so on. And actually it struck me as I was talking to them, I was well, why do they want to be in retreat? It was kind of your question. And I was it's because they had been doing their daily practice and they were getting so much out of it that they wanted to spend more time. It's they reached a point where they're well, that's all, I want to do more of that. It's working. They were feeling it's so joyful that I want to get the chance to do more, that I want to go do more of that. You know what I mean? And then when they were doing retreat, they were oh, it was let's say it right. Actually, talking to them, it was like talking to I have a young nephew, right? And when he talks about getting to play video games, his mom doesn't let him play my sister doesn't let him play video games too much, but then when he gets to it, he's so excited. They were like that. Does that make sense about meditation? Where it's oh wow, I get to be in a retreat, I get to do this practice, and I get to. So one point is so in that sense, retreat is where the person already knows the techniques and has been practicing them for a while, and it's if that's what you love and it's what's affecting, if you know also that that's what leads to happiness, is the point, right? And you have some experience of that then you want, and you want to be happy, right? Or you want to cultivate the states love and compassion and so on, then you want to have more time to do that. So in a way, a retreat should be a natural outgrowth of your practice, not some imposed discipline or something, I think. And I think when it's an imposed discipline, it's actually maybe not as effective or something, but it's more a natural expression of, you're already feeling the benefit of it, and then you want to do more.
So you're on the forward path.
Yeah, and the other thing and one other point I'll make, just from what people have said, and also my own experience a little bit, is that, that also there's a quality of, even whether it's a day-long retreat or a weekend retreat or a week or something, is if you're already practicing some meditation, like there's a quality where like, let's go right, like, let's say you've been practicing meditation and there comes a point where it's like, maybe I'll use the term like plateau, right? Like you're not, like in other words, you've had some benefit from it, something maybe is good or whatever, but it's like that. And then if you have like a little bit more time with it, it's like you can deepen something, or you can have some new little bit of experience, that then can help you the rest of the year. Like, so that, I remember like Lama Yeshe said, like he was advising his students, he was saying, they should every year do some retreat, like maybe a week, maybe a month, whatever, like in order to sort of deepen, because then that will sustain something new for their, and it's similar like if you're studying something, right? When you're studying, and then like you do that, when Kensei Rinpoche comes, you come and you like spend a week to study something, right? And then for the rest of that year, it's like something new to think about, and you apply it to your practice in a different way. But with meditation, it's similar. Like, so as if you're meditating every day, but then you get a period where you can even do a day, right? Or 2 days, it like gives you something that then you can apply the rest of your life and the rest of the year. And if you do that periodically, it sort of can bring more progress or something like that. I think that's the idea there. And then the same thing, right? So then when people like, so one of my friends I was talking to had done 3 years, but that was the same, I was like, it's the same thing for him. Actually, like, I was like, he did a 3-year, he just finished a 3-year retreat, but I was like, I can see it's the same as why somebody else would do a 1-week retreat. That he's in his 70s and has been practicing for 45, 50 years, but like it was like he was ready for that length of a new experience. Now if he goes around and teaches and then he does another retreat, it'll be a different level of experience because he has that experience from that long retreat in that case. But so I think for any of us though, even a 1 day though has an impact like that we carry forward. So that's to me. But we shouldn't do it. I guess on like another point, like I think I told this story once before. Like I was like that I think I told that story once. My sister was in Nepal, and she went to see Tulku Urgyen, who was a great Dzogchen master. And she said to him, I'm thinking of going up to the Himalayas and doing like a retreat or something. She and her friend went. And he said, why? And he had spent years and years in retreat, many, many years, right? And he said, why would you do that? It's a terrible idea, because like it wasn't coming out of an experience. It was like, and he said something like, it'll feel like you're in prison or something. That would be like, it'll feel like boring and like, he was like, do shorter. She was like thinking of doing a longer, maybe, I don't know, some weeks or something. He said, like go for a few days or something. Like, because if it doesn't come naturally out of our experience and we're pushing, then it doesn't really, it doesn't work, or something. Like, so it should be, again, like this thing with the short sessions, any retreat should also be, it should be based on our own knowledge of ourselves. Does that make sense? Like, that we should know, okay, like, it's like, so if you're like, if you feel like, a week would seem scary, then you shouldn't, not to you, but anybody, if they feel, then they shouldn't do a week, right? Do a day or something, or do a half a day. Do a length that feels like, that would be interesting to me. I would like to see what happens, and maybe it'll give me something interesting, It should feel like that going in, and then the session shouldn't be too long, and so on.
So going down to the Light of the Path retreats, that they're like, it was a month last time, and, I have a fairly short attention span. But to go down there, I know I get kind of blocked after 4 or 5 days, like, well, no, not 4 or 5 days, probably after a week. I just need to not go for a day. I need to go somewhere by myself and just for a day, and then I can come back and my head's wide open again for learning. But if I don't take that day, and a couple of times I fought that, to say discipline, because I really bad at discipline, figured have to work on this thing a little bit, but it was not productive. It was real counterproductive. In fact, there would be negative emotions that would start until I could just stop, get away, and come back.
And that shows, like, right, we each have to know ourselves
In a
and know
big
what
way,
works
it
for us.
shows, yeah. It was real blocking. And then turning negative. So last time I went down for the month, I think I took 2 days, one at like 2 weeks, and then during the last week I took another day and just go off into the forest by myself so I can open my head back up again. And I don't think of anything while I'm out there in the forest. It's just like I'm a part of a cloud or something. I just, it just needs that before it can be receptive again.
Yeah, I think when it kind of loses that element of joy, it becomes, like enlightened people are so joyful.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have an experience several times going on this one type of retreat. It's like 10 days, and roughly 100 hours, and I see the people, like, once when I was just walking around, they're like squeezing their eyes, and they're like, I have to get through this hour, you know, without moving, and like, where's the joy? It's all gone. And yeah, like you said, it's counterproductive, and they end up having an aversion to the whole experience after they're done. It kind of gets planted in the back of their mind that it's not pleasant.
Yeah, and then I think it's, right, that'd be a mistake, wouldn't it? So,
Because that is, I mean, a month is a long time. I've heard a lot of people say, you know, can't go and focus on that, but you can if you listen kind of to yourself and then break it up and then really get more out of it, just what you can get out of it. I mean, it's not a contest.
No.
Yeah.
yeah, I'll even make, I mean, for just, not necessarily for you guys, but for other, in case you're ever helping somebody else or in that situation, like, I'll say too, like, I mean, about these ideas of intensive retreats that you're both talking about and happen. Even actually, I think it's a version of the mental excitation. I've seen it happen numerous times, let's put it that way, where somebody did too long a retreat for them and they were pushing too hard, like as you're saying, this sort of pushing thing. And then if the person, like sometimes it even leads to, like, I've seen a number of people have that, where they had a kind of sort of breakdown, a psychological breakdown, or nervous breakdown or something, like, and again, it's because the person wasn't taking care of it, like, they were pushing themselves to keep up with somebody else, or pushing, one friend of mine had that, where he thought, he had some positive experience and he thought he was going to become enlightened, but he was like pushing and pushing, and it's the mental excitation is the problem, right? And if a person, anybody, if they have too much mental excitation, it leads to a kind of psychological problem, you know, and so, if you see somebody else, a friend of yours or something, like, the idea is like what you're saying, it shouldn't be, how'd you say it, you know, it should be joyful, it should be peaceful, it should be, and so if somebody's sort of too pushing and too, you know, that's not the point of retreat, and actually that leads to psychological problems. So if you see somebody else doing that, even help them, you know, tell them that's not the point. You know, it's
Even
like,
tiredness, I was very fortunate to have somebody tell me I have to push myself too far. You're tired, go to bed. You don't have to stay, because, you know, Lama Tsongkhapa can talk till 3 a.m. sometimes, you know. And when your head says, go to bed, give it another chance, and if it says it again, go. You know, otherwise, I know the one time that I didn't do that, I got really weepy, and I mean, being tired just isn't a conducive way of learning, and especially spirit learning, or whatever kind of learning you want to call it.
so it's very much spiritual. Yeah.
Spirit
Form of
learning.
self-compassion.
Yeah.
I think if we're not showing ourselves self-compassion, then how can we show it to others?
Exactly.
And in Nepal, usually, like when we were growing up, there used to be this Vipassana center, bunch of it, and I think Goenka is a famous one in there. And then recall people would go there for 10 days. So you'll have a set regime where, you know, wake up 5 in the morning and discipline and blah blah blah. And people coming out from there without fail would say, like, what an experience, you know, we had great time, so much of discipline, something came in my thought. To me, it almost sounds like insight coming that could easily come on a daily basis too, from my experience. So I don't know how to correlate that. And it's a first person experience again. So, but then intense. My idea about the intense retreat would be that, oh, I'm willing to go and spend that 5 days without talking to anybody, without doing nothing, and some great insight is gonna come, or something gonna, not with the expectation,
Yeah.
but just for the following the path part of it.
Yeah.
That makes sense, sort of. Same thing like you said, don't force yourself, but then
Yeah, and it should
because
feel
it's meant
organic.
for you.
I think it should feel organic,
Yeah,
like you, or this
organic,
person
yeah.
feels, oh, I want to do that, it feels ready, it feels right to me. You know, like, because I've had people say that to me also, like, oh, like, you know, I'm thinking of doing this 5-day, but it feels like so much. Well, then why would they do, like, better to do something shorter than, you know, like just like what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? And the same thing, right? I mean, there is also like, I mean, he's saying that, right? If you're suffering a temporary mental or physical harm, stop, you know. So that would apply in retreat as well as in daily practice.
So talking about the isolation, I mean, I recently came across a woman who didn't speak for like 9 months or a year. She just decided not to speak. And so she had written something about it. And obviously if you don't speak for 9 months, a lot of things will come to your mind. It's a verbal isolation, one of the tattva stuff we talk about. Similarly, you could do a lot of things on your own. I mean, to give you an example, if the isolation and the renunciation is going to give you something, it could happen at its own level as well.
Yeah, I understand, but again, and it should be joyful, like, again, if, like, you know, because, it's funny, like, right, because what's it called, solitary isolation is like the form of, it's like, if you're already in prison.
The
and
one
then
in
they
Kopan,
torture you.
Kopan is the most famous one.
But remember that though, right, like, it's, or is it, if somebody's not ready for that, then it's just a form of torture, right? Like, and think of somebody in prison, if they say, oh, we're gonna put you in solitary, and they go, oh, no, I don't wanna go in solitary confinement, like, that's not the point, right? Like, it should feel joyful, so the person really shouldn't be doing it, actually. Like, you know, it should feel, or interesting, or something, or the person wants to, you know, it's like, oh, wow, this is an interesting experiment. If the person's feeling that way, then it's good, but if the person's feeling like, oh, no, I have to be silent, well, then they probably shouldn't be doing that. Like, that was what struck me when I was talking to these people who had done the long retreats, like, I thought, oh, that's a really good sign. Like, one friend, she was saying, like, oh, like, I'm so happy to be here, I feel so grateful, I wake up every morning and I feel like, oh, all those poor people who have to have, like, busy lives doing meaningless things, like, I get to be here and look at the, and she was, like, blissed out. I was like, oh, that's a good sign, her meditation's going, like you were saying, right? It's like a sign of happy, I should be happy, you know. But let's do just, we usually do 2 verses of dedication. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara is